Thank you, everybody, for joining our event today. Really excited to talk today about online harms and how we should regulate big tech. My name is Rachel Fielden, and I'm from WebRoots Democracy, and I'm also at Moonshot CVE, where I work on countering online harms. And I'm honored today to be chairing this panel, especially since I'm joined by such esteemed panelists, including Labour MP Darren Jones, digital rights researcher Dr. Eleanor Carmi, and the human rights campaigner Alvin Carpia, who's currently in the midst of suing Facebook for their role in the Cambridge Analytica scandal. So some really great panelists today, super excited to get into it. But before we get going, today's event is somewhat bittersweet, as some of you may already know. This event is one of many taking place across this week as part of WebRoots Democracy Festival, which marks the end of the organization after 6.5 wonderful years. It's been such a pleasure to be involved in this organization, to work with on side of Arik, especially since it's worked on such amazing topics like this. And it's really sad to see such a great organization come to an end. But I'm also really, really glad that we have this one last opportunity to get together to celebrate all the work it's done through valuable discussions such as this. If you're following along online and wish to tweet about today's discussion, please do by using the hashtag WebRootsFest, which we found in the chat now. We'll also leave the Twitter handles of the speakers in the chat too, in case you want to follow up with anything. If you're following us on Zoom or Facebook Live, please feel free to send questions throughout, and we'll put them to the panelists towards the end, maybe in the final 15 or so minutes. So without further ado, let's get started. Before we dive in and start talking about how we regulate big tech, I suppose we should break it down a bit. Start with the what and the why. What are online harms? What are we talking about when we use that term? And why should we be addressing it? Eleanor, your research into deviant media, how have you, in doing this research, how have you defined online harms? And what are we talking about here? And why is this a topic that matters to you?
Thank you for your question. So my book, if I can shamelessly promote it here as well, is open access and you can download it. And it also has an amazing playlist if you like dark music. I think for me, online harms is one way to put it. I basically investigated how media companies shape how we use and understand mediated environments. I focused on 3 different time periods, and one of them was how the digital advertising industry lobbied in order for us to basically experience how we experience it today. So, you know, with the surveillance and ad tech ecosystem that big tech companies like Facebook and Amazon and Microsoft have been amplifying throughout. So for me, the deviant it keeps on changing. And so so for me, deviant and online harms is 2 different things, because the way that the UK government has dealt with it is a quite narrow way. I don't know if you've managed to read the actual online harms report, but the way that I view it, at least, is that it mainly looks at content. And I think the main harms that are happening today, and I'm sure that Alvin will agree because that's what he's basically dealing with, is not only about content, right? It's about these kind of problematic communication, surveillance communication that are, you know, conducted with cookies and algorithms and different kind of computational features that are creating really problematic infrastructures for people. I'm also talking about problematic, different kind of designed in terms of consent mechanisms, which are not really, you know, helpful and have not been useful for people. So when I'm talking about harms, it goes much beyond content. It is about algorithms. It is about what kind of privacy choices do we have, and whether we have alternatives. And at the moment, the UK government doesn't tackle any of these. It only focuses on content. So I think that in order for us to move forward, we need to think about these things as well.
Yeah, thanks. That's incredibly interesting. Alvin, would you say this fits within your definition as well of what online harms are and what's most important to tackle for you?
Thanks for letting me speak. And also, I just want to first off say that I want to send a huge thank you to Arik. Arik has been a friend, a colleague, an ally for years. And even though WebRoots is closing, it's the beginning of a new chapter for Arik and everybody who's been impacted by the work he and his team have done. So first off, thanks, Arik, for bringing us together once again. And I'm sure it'll be not the end, but just a new chapter. I think it's really good to be discussing this at this point, given that Mark Zuckerberg and Twitter had been answering some of the questions around this recently. Just to put into context kind of where I'm coming from today, as you mentioned, Rachel, I'm working with lawyers to take on legal action against Facebook, in particular due to the misuse of our data when it came to the Cambridge Analytica scandal. So there were 1 million people whose data was harvested, including my own, and I'm sure, I'm guessing many of you in the room or those listening, where back in 2013 and 2014, people's data, we were friends of friends, but we didn't actually use the app. It was called This Is Your Digital Life. Our data was harvested by this app without our permission, knowledge or consent. So when it comes to online harms, there's a big thing here about trust, and there's something here about privacy, and there's something here about accountability. And so in terms of online harms, there needs to be a very kind of good, shall I say, relationship between both the users and the people and the companies that run these technologies. And for myself, you know, we tried to raise awareness about this, as did many different people during the wake of Cambridge Analytica scandal. We ran petitions to try and hold these companies to account. We've actually got 177,000 signatures of people saying, you know, this form of online harm can't be left alone. And there was no answer. And so for 2 years, we've been waiting for an answer and nothing's happened. And right now, the way I've approached it with my team is to say, look, now it's time to take legal action. And that's why I'm working with the lawyers at Milberg London to organize this class action against Facebook. So there are many ways, the point being, of holding companies account in regards to online harms. And governments can play a role, the businesses themselves can play a role, but also can we as citizens can play a role too.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's incredibly interesting and great work that you're doing. Both Alvin and Eleanor have mentioned the government there and what the government's doing and how the government defines online harms. Would you mind speaking to that as you know, being chair of the Labour Digital?
Sure. Well, thanks, Rachel. But before, can I just also share my thanks and congratulations to Arik and the team at WebRoots. When I first got involved with your events many years ago, I could tell that you guys were trailblazers in this debate. And the good news is that you leave a legacy behind you, not just with your own network, but with the kind of political discourse on these issues. And I'm thrilled about that, because when I was first elected to the House in 2017, I felt a little bit lonely talking about technology policy, but now lots of people are talking about it. And that's credit to the work that you've done, as well as the work of your network. And I think the networks that you've established through the work over the past 6 years will obviously continue to flourish as this debate becomes more important. So congratulations to you and the best of luck in your new job as well, Arik. Online harms. I mean, I'm conscious this debate, you know, we always start with the question of actually what is it that we're trying to deal with here, and the impact of digital platforms, digitization technology affects every area of public policy. So you have to be careful not to try to boil the ocean. There's a whole host of really difficult issues, whether it's about digital security, with the Prime Minister talking about the integrated review today, digital tax, competition issues, reform of digital markets, digitization, productivity, digital skills, inequality, and access to technology. So I'm going to focus very, very specifically today on the issue of online harms, because we've been waiting for a long time for draft legislation from the government. And the UK was ahead of the curve internationally on thinking about this issue, but it has slowed down and we've started to fall behind the curve. And I think that's unfortunate. I was recently in a debate on this issue in the House of Commons, and the minister, we've had a lot of Secretary of States and a lot of ministers. This is part of the problem. There's been a lot of turnover in political leadership on this bill over the last few years, but there was a commitment to publishing the full response to the white paper before Christmas, so that so for the first time we have a full view about the government's intention of what it wants to try to deal with within the bill on online harms, with a view to then introducing the legislation in early 2021. There's a discussion, it's a bit technically boring, I suppose, but whether we have something called pre-legislative scrutiny or not. Pre-legislative scrutiny is when both houses, so members of the House of Lords and the Commons, come together to take evidence from people such as you guys about the drafting of the legislation. I think that's actually really important on this topic, but also we don't want it to slow down the legislation too much, and sometimes that can be a risk. And on that point around external kind of involvement in the debate in politics around the bill, there's long been a discussion about who decides what is true, who decides what is illegal, who decides what's legal, who decides what's a harm, and how do you deal with all of that? And look, it's not easy, is it? There are some obvious things that are illegal that we've already made legal. That's our job as legislators. So clearly, terrorist content, child exploitation, and those types of issues are kind of the easy ones. When you get into this difficult space in the middle about things that maybe aren't illegal by statute, but are harmful, how do you manage that? And that's why I like the concept from the government around a duty of care and a regulator with the power to enforce that. It takes the kind of detail out of the hands of Parliament. Parliament sets principles, not detail. It then needs to be enforced properly in the real world through specialist regulators. And the duty of care is super important because it will put a legal requirement on the people that run businesses, such as Facebook and other social media platforms, to have to think at the highest levels about the broader responsibilities they have to their users, not just to their shareholders. But that duty of care has to be accompanied with proper enforcement by a regulator with the capacity, the power, and the ability to enforce that in a way that, based on the size of the business, is seen to be a real risk and not just maybe a small fine that, if you're as big as Facebook, for example, you can just kind of, brush it off. There is some concern that ministers might be diluting the duty of care and moving instead to a model where we look at standards in terms and conditions. That is not good enough. I was a technology lawyer before becoming an MP, worked in consumer legislation, and voluntary kind of work around terms and conditions really doesn't cut it on this issue. So from a parliamentary perspective, on a cross-party basis, as will be referred to in the debate on this issue in the House of Commons this afternoon, I think we'll be pushing quite hard, not just for the legislation to come forward, but for that commitment to a regulator with the staffing, skills, capacity and power, plus a duty of care, plus fines and enforcement powers that really matter, so that this system can work. And ultimately, it is for Parliament and regulators to do the difficult work, to try to decide on behalf of us as a country, as democratically elected representatives, how you deal with that difficult stuff around definitions. I don't think it should be for Mark Zuckerberg in California to decide what is harmful and what's not harmful. It's for us to decide that, and we can't really duck our responsibility on that, and we've got to do that properly.
Yeah, definitely. I think one question I've just been thinking of as you were all speaking then is, I think when we're talking about this issue, I think what first comes to mind is like big tech, right? Like we're thinking Facebook, we're thinking Google, Twitter, and so on and so forth. And it just reminds me of a scandal that just came out this week about the Muslim prayer app that basically discovered that the US government, the Department of Homeland Security, had been purchasing data from users from the app through a third-party provider. And so I guess I want to ask to all of our panelists, who are we talking about here? Are we just talking tech companies, or are we talking about these middlemen, like third-party data buyers and sellers?
I just want to say as well, first of all, thank you so much, Arik. I actually met him I think a year ago. And since then we've been in ongoing conversations, and I think the amazing events and also topics that he's focusing on and the project and the organization has been focusing on, especially around minorities and Black and ethnic populations in the UK, which is something that is extremely important. And I think that everything that we're talking about harms is especially harming these communities. So I think that the work of the organization, of his work and the organization on it is extremely important. And I'm sure that he'll be taking on these issues wherever he will go. I think if I can jump into your question, I think along with what you said, we also discovered this week with the Privacy International that the European Union has also sold surveillance technology to countries outside of the EU, to non-Western regions. I think that exactly this kind of the normalization of surveillance is something that we need to stop. So for me, one of the main challenges today is to make it be not okay to surveil on us. I mean, if you would have like tens and 100 of people following you on the street, you would feel really uncomfortable, right? But when people navigate online, they don't feel all of these cookies and all of these surveillance technologies. So I think that if we would, start to make this uncomfortable and sort of show how harmful these, practices are, then we can tackle this both on, on companies, but also the government would start to have a reckoning that they need to start having.
Yeah, Elvin, Darren, do you have anything on that point?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question in terms of where the buck stops or where responsibility lies. I think you can make an argument that each and every one of us, and whichever sector you're in, we have a different type of responsibility. I think for me as a representative claimant of 1 million folk who are taking legal action against Facebook, we truly believe responsibility does lie with these big tech firms, in particular in this case, Facebook, and therefore there should be accountability. We, of course, allege that Facebook broke the law just in terms of the Data Protection Act, where there is a need for companies to protect our data from third-party providers. And so that's why we're taking them to court, because we believe that allegedly has been broken. And therefore, in this particular case, 1 million of us had our data misused. And we didn't give our data to Cambridge Analytica, we gave our data to Facebook. So the responsibility there lies with their handling of our data. And so there's a very clear responsibility with the tech firm itself. When we look at how the government has responded before, at least regulators, the ICO, of course, have fined Facebook for the maximum amount of £500,000. However, this is, of course, a slap on the wrist compared to the $70 billion revenue which Facebook made last year. And none of that went directly to the people who are impacted by this. And that's why we're taking this particular form of legal action, because it's about getting redress and compensation for the people impacted. So in order to answer your question, the question of responsibility is different for each case, and it needs to be taken on a case-by-case basis. But clearly there are different sets of responsibilities. And in this case, that we can't say that Facebook weren't responsible because of the fact that we did have the Data Protection Act as well as the ICO. I mean, they wouldn't have accepted to pay the fine if there was no wrongdoing. But now we need to make sure that the proper bit of compensation is made for people who are impacted.
I mean, from my perspective, Rachel, maybe it's because my job is a legislator, so I fall into this argument, but ultimately the buck stops with institutions like Parliament, right? And then multilateral cooperation, whether it's with the OECD or otherwise. Because when people say to me, oh, and I've said this myself, to be fair, but Amazon doesn't pay enough tax. Well, okay, fine, but actually they are complying with the law. So if you want to change that, you've got to change the law and kind of make it the case, right? They're not just going to give you money out of goodwill, because companies don't do that. That's not what they kind of exist for. And on this type of issue, you raised a really important question, Rachel. How do you deal with a company the size of Facebook versus maybe a startup that's trying to compete with Facebook, which, by the way, is now an impossible, which is why we've got to look at competition laws around monopolization of these platforms. But, is it kind of unfairly advantaged? Does it reduce competitive forces? Is it just big companies with groups of lawyers and lobbyists that can deal with this? Equally, then what happens to the state? The state has a function in this as well. What the rules for how the state uses this, whether it's about policing or health or algorithmic decision making or whatever it might be, the police use of biometric data. These arguments pop up everywhere, and that's why fundamentally I think it comes down to a question of fundamental rights. One of it doesn't get debated very much, but one of the many sad things about Brexit is that, as you probably all know, at a European level, there's a fundamental right around data protection and your privacy, which we are choosing to get rid of as part of the Brexit process. We're not reinstigating that into domestic legislation, and ministers can't really explain to me why they're not doing that. Their argument is, well, European fundamental rights don't really work very well, so why would we copy it? I mean, I'm not sure that's a feasible argument. You either have a fundamental right or you don't. And if you do, why are you not willing to put that into a legally binding commitment in statute? And only if we do get to that position, and that's why on the Labour side of the argument, we've been long calling for a digital bill of rights that try to deal with these fundamental principles, not just GDPR, but the whole range of principles, so that it then ultimately doesn't matter about kind of which outlet you're thinking about. The fundamental right is there in law, and kind of everybody has to comply within what is a reasonable and proportionate kind of regulatory system. And I think until we kind of solve those kind of horizontal fundamental issues, we're constantly going to be trying to catch up on these discussions as things pop up all over the place as a consequence of use of data and privacy. Oh, you're on mute, Rachel. You win the prize.
Yes, I am. Sorry, it's difficult. The sun has finally come out after all this time and it's just straight in my eyes. I can't really see what's going on. But I just wanted to say that that was incredibly interesting, all of your points there. You mentioned something though, Darren, about competition. And is there a risk in like the regulation of big tech companies and what that will mean further down the line for regulation going forward for any smaller companies that come up or come into the fold?
Yes. The United States Congress just did a report through its Justice Committee on anti-competitive forces from the big tech companies, which are essentially monopolies these days, is the argument. Europe has obviously been proactive on these issues for many years with Margaret Vestager when she was the competition lead at the Commission, and now with her kind of expanded portfolio as Vice President. Although interesting division in Europe between competition enforcement and digital policy and data policy. So probably, unfortunately, that's not going to be our problem any longer, as much as I'd like it to be. And then in the UK, our Competition and Markets Authority has done work on digital markets, wants to be more proactive on these issues, but is essentially waiting for government to catch up. And also, by the way, to announce what our post-Brexit competition policy is going to be anyway, because actually ministers haven't confirmed that for the whole organisation and the whole policy framework, let alone just digital markets, which hopefully they'll do before the end of December. Otherwise, who knows what we're up to from the 1st of January. And that, I think, then as a kind of sovereign nation in partnership with the European Union and others, we need to find global consensus on some of these issues, because as we saw with our attempt, albeit a bold attempt, to introducing a digital sales tax to deal with some of these anti-competitive forces, Amazon just said, well, nice try, British Parliament, we're just going to push this down onto the SMEs that sell their goods on our platform and increase their cost at a time when they don't need that. Tough, what are you going to do about it? And then actually nothing happened. And so you have to work on a multilateral basis to do that, which has proven difficult through the OECD so far, not least because President Trump was so anti kind of regulation on these issues. Evidently, assuming we can drag him out of the White House, it'll be interesting to see what the Biden transition team thinks about these issues. It might be a new opportunity to find international consensus.
Yeah, speaking of the election, actually, there's been quite a heated debate around Facebook and Twitter now coming in, and maybe this is I digress a bit from the main topic at hand, but about stepping in and fact-checking politicians. And this is a question to the whole panel. Do we think that this is a bit too little too late? Is this overstepping their boundaries? In terms of their role, you mentioned, Darren, that we as the government, as elected officials, should be deciding what's harmful. How does that work when Trump is the president of the United States, and when not every country, not saying that the UK is necessarily fair, but has people that you can trust to make up what a harm truly is? Really broad question, several questions in one, but throw it to all of you.
I think that, first of all, I want to emphasize all of the measures that have been done by these platforms at the moment are only in the US and only relate to the USA election. So these companies are global. However, all of the measures that they've been doing lately are only in the USA because that's the only country apparently that matters. So I think that when we talk about these things, it's quite important to understand that all of the debates that we had right now are only about stuff that's happening there. And a lot of other countries have been harmed for the past decades continuously, so to me, one of the main issues beyond, having them making different kind of decisions and filtering and content moderations which don't really work, you can have like Steve Bannon calling for beheading, which will be, fine, apparently, according to them. But then when you have like small businesses that are being harmed by their, anti-political advertising, we don't really know how they define political. That's not okay. And you had a New York Times article yesterday saying how all of these small companies are being harmed by their problematic definition of what is political. So for me, the problem is that these companies are, economic companies that are making money from advertising, and all of their decision-making process relies on that. And we just have to remember that. So having like them making all of these decisions is obviously problematic. But again, it's not only about content, it's about algorithms as well. And it's about different kind of, features. And for me, actually one of the most problematic things is, what Alvin is talking about, right? Like we gave Facebook our data. Actually, we didn't give Facebook our data because Facebook keeps on changing their, their terms of use all the time. And I should know because I did that in my PhD, and I actually cataloged their terms of use for more than a year and showed how that keeps on changing. So these kind of contracts that we're used to, they're not normal, and we normalize them, but actually this is not okay. Like if I sign a contract with my landlord and all of a sudden he says, hi, I'm actually decided that I'm going to join you to the house and I'm going to bring my whole family, we would think that that is strange, right? But when Facebook keeps on changing the contract all the time, it's like, oh, this is okay. It's not okay. Most people don't understand what's happening to their data. And in fact, as part of my research, I'm doing research which is called Me and My Big Data. It's funded by the Newfield Foundation, where we try to understand people's data literacies. And what we find is that people don't really understand even basic things like what is data, what companies collect on them. So when we're talking about this, I gave Facebook, no, we didn't give Facebook anything. And most people, when they press the I agree button, which is also the only button that they offer because you can't say I don't agree, then, most people don't understand what that means. So for me, all of the things that we're talking about is based on a flawed market and on a flawed contract. That this is the harms that we're talking about, right? Like this is a contract where am I as a citizen or as a consumer? Where's my choice here? I don't have any choice. So to me, these are the fundamentals that we should actually talk about, not if Trump is being censored here or there. These are, for me, the fundamentals of these problematic market and these problematic platforms, and hopefully the government will tackle these things.
Rachel, is it right if I jump in on
Yeah,
this?
go for it.
I just, on your point about competition, it's quite interesting just in terms of the current economy as it stands and the way it's going with a lot of the move from offline to online. And in a way, I'm speaking now, given my startup experience, and there's a word in kind of like VC culture, which is around kind of the network effect. And so every time you add somebody to a platform, the more valuable it becomes, and therefore more people join because there's a bigger network. And of course, Facebook is the prime example of that, starting off in Harvard and then enabling people, all of us effectively, to be on the platform. So it makes it quite difficult in terms of other startups to try and, compete with your Facebooks, with others. But what's interesting is you see TikTok and some of the kind of global questions around, how do you encourage national and regional growth of companies versus allowing, if you will, international competitors to join. But one thing I would say is that the chief exec of Evernote described kind of startups and mid-sized companies and big companies like Facebook as rock, paper, scissors. So your startups are your scissors, your mid-sized companies are your rocks, and your big companies like Facebook are your papers. And it's only actually the startups that are able to cut away the big paper companies. So you never know how things are going to work out, particularly in the online economy. So it'll be interesting to see how people like Darren and those in government kind of create laws, because of course, monopolies can have impacts on online harms and also in terms of harms to the economy and competitiveness of startups.
Just one thing I would add there, which is one of the questions I don't yet have an answer to. I said earlier that Parliament regulators are the place where we need to decide what is illegal, legal, harmful. What I'm not convinced we're best placed to do in Parliament is to decide what is truth, which is very different. And this kind of goes to the question about the platforms dealing with, President Trump's tweets and kind of disinformation on the Facebook platform. And I think this is one of the hardest questions that we've really got to try to find some innovative solutions to. Before the lockdown, I was on a trade mission in Southeast Asia, and one of the stops was in Singapore. And we met the civil service team in Singapore who, I can't remember the name of the legislation there now, but they implemented a new law where essentially, if the civil service team felt that there was disinformation online, they could force the online companies to put a little note under it to say that the government of Singapore thinks that this is incorrect. If you'd like to see the government's version of events, kind of click here, and then it shows you. So they don't take it down, but they just kind of say, hey, we don't think this is right. What was interesting though is it was actually quite a small team of, and I don't say this in an ageist way, but kind of fairly young people who were just kind of deciding whether it was something that should have like a note attached to it, which from a British perspective, where we think about institutions and kind of independence and rule of law, felt a little bit kind of informal. But to be fair to the Singaporeans, they were the first to try to deal with this issue. And then when it came to kind of the COVID lockdown, where there was kind of fake news about outbreaks of COVID and kind of this type of stuff, they were able to kind of manage that in a way. Now, I'm not saying that's what we should do in the UK, but it's an interesting case study. I think where I probably fall on this question of truth is that the state needs to fund independent organizations which have diverse and balanced people, kind of voices like fact checker and stuff, which currently don't receive any government funding, to kind of do that fact checking work, where you can bring different people together, independent sources, reliable institutions. It means you can't deal with everything in seconds, which some people think we need to be able to do through kind of algorithmic decision making. I just don't think, or at least I don't think that works. So it's a bit slower, but I think that provides a really important check and balance. And the state should be funding organizations to be able to exist to do that, as long as there's proper kind of oversight about how it's done in a transparent and diverse way.
Yeah, no, thank you. I kind of want to bring it back to what Eleanor mentioned about, all of these internal changes that Facebook have been making have been very US focused. And I guess that will speak a lot to the work that you're doing, Darren, but also the case that you're pursuing, Alvin. How do we regulate tech companies given that position, given that they're not necessarily based in the UK? And how, do we have the global institutions that are equipped and required to do this kind of work? Or is it kind of, a country by country basis? How exactly do you think this work could most effectively get done, and if that's even possible or feasible?
Two, I think, important but distinctive questions there. First, around, is there a multilateral organization where this work can get done? I don't think there is. I chair a group of legislators around the world interested in artificial intelligence regulation, which we run through something called the Institute of AI. And I have two observations. One, the reason I set that up is because there wasn't anywhere else really to go. The OECD does some stuff now, but that's obviously only OECD nations. The World Economic Forum is starting to do a little bit on that as well, but beyond that, there wasn't really anywhere for people like me to talk to people like me in other countries about these issues. The last roundtable that we did with legislators around the world was with the ITU, which is the International Telecommunications Union at the United Nations, which is probably the kind of best option you have. But then they very clearly set out the challenges, right? You're never going to get a globally agreed ethical framework because ethics means different things in different jurisdictions. And some countries, China, Russia, others, will just say, well, that's not how we operate in our country. So you then have two options. You either say, oh, well, there's no point, we'll just do our own kind of domestic things. I think that's the wrong answer. Or you say, we'll take a two-pronged approach. One, we'll find the common values, the common principles, which unify all of us across different jurisdictions, and try to agree a cooperative form of institutional setup that allows us to at least continue to talk and collaborate on these issues, which I think is important. And then secondly, where we are able to collaborate across jurisdictions where there is agreement to form international standards and interoperability of technologies within the regulatory framework, but that has to be done at scale. And the challenge for the UK now, not being part of the European Union, is that we can legislate for our own country. And of course, we have the authority to do that. We can just get on and do it. But that's not going to change international trends because our market is too small. We don't have a big enough country anymore. So we have to make a decision about whether we'd stay close to the European Union and collaborate on European Union standards, which would be my preference, whether we tilt to the kind of more United States approach in our ambitions for a trade deal, including digital, with the United States, and probably take a more deregulatory approach, or whether we try to play a role internationally that kind of sits in the middle of that and tries to bring what Britain has often, been credited with, which is kind of thinking about values-based ethical applications of technology and trying to, through soft power, bring people together to find points of consensus. We've talked a bit about that as a country in the past, but I don't think we've done enough on that. And quite frankly, the Canadians and the French are kind of storming ahead, really. And it's a question for us about whether we really want to be back in the mix on that in terms of international collaboration.
I think that your microphone is...
Oh, well, I was just about to throw it to you, actually. So go ahead. Do you have any?
I think, and I'm sorry that my neighbors decided to renovate today, so there might be some drilling behind me now. For me, one of the main issues is that the way that big tech companies are regulated is wrong, fundamentally, and I think that we need to start regulating them like the pharmaceutical companies, which means that technology companies can't, just move fast and break things, but they need to go through ethical boards before they put stuff outside to the world, because they actually harm people. These are real harms. So to me, it's quite crazy that they can just do something and then it's like, oh, we're so sorry. A lot of people died or a lot of people, whatever. We didn't mean that. We're going to change that. And, we're going to do all of these laws, but actually, it doesn't really matter. And we do, like Darren says, I really hope that the UK will have laws under the EU, but with all due respect, the GDPR is not working. And there was a research a couple of months ago showing how DPAs don't get enough funding and there's not enough enforcement, and that actually even the Irish DPA barely deals with less than 1% of the cases. So we have regulations, right? But when it comes to enforcement, it actually doesn't mean anything. And this is because these regulations come after the technology's already been set to the world and breaking things. So for me, the way that we're thinking about regulations of big technology companies is the wrong way. And we need to actually, create rules where actually, they can just release whatever they want and they can just, do these kind of algorithmic changes whenever they want. This is, so it means like a whole different way of thinking about it. I think it's possible. I think if we're thinking about 10 years ago, how everybody was smoking everywhere, and now it's like, it's crazy, right? Like I'm going to restaurants and bars and clubs and there are no smoking. That was a huge cultural shift. We need a huge cultural shift here, and it's possible. It just means that we need to start thinking about this differently.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Actually, sorry, go on now.
So back in 2016, I attended Davos, and that was the time when they coined the term the fourth industrial revolution. And it was so fascinating as somebody who's kind of like been a grassroots community organizer to see these world leaders talk about technology and how they're going to shape this new industrial revolution for us all globally. So it was really interesting just being an observer. I was there to kind of try and see if we can do things on poverty in the UK. But leaving that, set up an organization called the Fourth Group, because it was very clear that our interests in terms of civil society weren't necessarily represented. So I'm talking about the people who were working in these places, who had been impacted but didn't have a say. And so what we tried to do at the Fourth Group, based on a hypothesis that we were all being impacted by these global tech companies, was to build an international movement to hold these tech companies to account. And what I can say after 4 years of trying to do that is that it's bloody hard. Even though there are shared common interests, Darren's totally right that each and every country has its own ethics, has its own ways of thinking, has its own ways of regulating, and has its own forms of different types of economy. So I think the global, even though these companies have been very successful in expanding globally, they also have their challenges. And that's why I feel at this point, the sovereignty of the nation is probably one of the best routes to regulate, because each nation is different, and that's just the way it is at this point. But there is room for international kind of support, and that's what we did. So what we did is have different community groups across different continents, providing each other with information about the different kinds of actions you could do, so that if we did an action in London outside of headquarters and do a petition, somebody could do that outside a headquarters in, say, Medellin or another part of the world. And so I think global collaboration is necessary, but it's very bloody difficult. And what I would warn against, though, is the bit about global tech firms self-regulating. So, of course, we have seen the creation of boards and independent groups, and whether or not you think they're independent or not is up for your judgment. But it's very interesting to see who joins these boards and these councils, and also to see the longevity and the lifespan, because often they just quickly die out. So the bit about self-regulation is interesting. I think it's positive because it means that they're proactively thinking about how they can respond internally. But there is, of course, some skepticism as to the true value. And the final bit is around legal representation. So I've mentioned the term representative action and collective action. But just to explain what it is, it's effectively a legal case where many people have the same interest or the same impact had to them, and therefore you can have one person representing them in one case, and therefore if you, the case is brought on by a representative claimant. And I think what's really interesting to see the kind of development of this whole legal way of holding big companies to account, because this case against Facebook was very much inspired by Richard Lloyd's taking on Google. And so I'm very curious to see whether or not citizens in the future and representative actions will take off as a means to hold these companies to account.
Yeah. You all raised some really, really interesting and kind of it just makes me ever more aware of the work that needs to be done and how important the work it is that you guys are all doing. And so before we move on to questions, I just thought, like, what are some positive changes that you guys have seen? Have you guys seen any move towards a future that you'd like to see, a positive future, a hopeful future, in the past few years of doing the work that you've done? Or, is there anything on the horizon that we can hopefully see sometime soon?
I can definitely say that I really loved how the young kids in the UK protested against the algorithms of their exams. And I think that is a clear example of how, when people understand how algorithms and platforms hurt them, how they actually raise their voices. I think it's hard for us to see it now with other, kind of things, because people don't always necessarily see the direct harm. So I think the more we see harm, people would understand how these platforms harm them, the more actions we see. We see it from activists like Max Schrems, who is fighting also now against Apple. And I'm hopeful. I think that we need alternatives. I think that we need to regulate. I think that from my perspective, working on data literacies, we definitely need to create these kind of education systems and infrastructures for citizens to actually understand what's happening. Most citizens don't really understand how these platforms work, what is like the political economy of them, and all of these things. And I think that it's really important for us to move forward. So this is from me.
Thank you. Alvin, Darren, anything to add?
Yeah, of course. I mean, this is a bit of a cheeky one, but what I would say is that even though this was the last event of WebRoots, in a way I kind of knew what to expect, but also I was, and actually this reminds me of, Rachel, you said, of all the work that needs to be done. But also I think this group of people who are in this call and listening, we're a very small group of people. And what I realized is, like, sometimes when you're in a bubble, you think there are many people like us. But actually, when you look out in the world, and there are not many people who are holding big technology companies to account in terms of the work they do, the organizations they work for. And so what I would say is, it is a sad day that WebRoots has to close. The fourth group itself had its challenges, and we've seen .everyone and other organizations having to move on. So I think that partly is worrying, But also this conversation makes me hopeful because it just shows there are people who want to do something on this. The question is how, and the question is how the hell are we going to fund this in order to make it sustainable? Because I think that's a big question. Darren, you mentioned, fact checkers and, the ability potentially for governments to fund it. I can understand why maybe they might not want to be to prove their independence. However, there must be other ways in order to fund a very small group of people who are looking at questions on the edge of ethics and technology, who are doing great work, but are struggling at many times to be financially sustainable. So I think it's a mixed bag there, where it's like, we know the reality, but also there's a clear passion and a want to do something. So I think, to be cheeky, I'd say even this conversation for me gives me hope for the future.
I mean, I think on the funding question, at the moment, people that work in the space rely largely on philanthropic donations to be able to do the work. The whole point about government spending is that it's spending collectively on behalf of all of us as taxpayers, but as citizens. And so, I think it would be a reasonable request to ministers to ring fence some funding to be able to fund those types of organisations, and it's certainly something that I'll continue to suggest. The thing that gives me hope is, I've been in elected office not for very long, for three years. I was elected in 2017 and re-elected in 2019. But I've seen a huge difference in that time around the level of interest from politicians. We've got a lot more to do. There's a lot of politicians that still don't really kind of get these issues, but the number has increased significantly. And actually, the exams algorithm, if you've been seeing it, the kind of housing allocation algorithm, suddenly people are talking about things like algorithms, whereas 5 minutes ago they had no idea what an algorithm was. So that gives me hope, and it's not just hope at a domestic level. The work that I do internationally on artificial intelligence, when I decided there must be other people interested in this question, I essentially just wrote to a load of people around the world who I thought from some kind of Google research might be interested legislators, in the hope there might be 2 or 3 or whatever. Actually, the demand has been very significant, so much so to go to the funding point, it's hard for us to kind of keep up. But that also gives me hope, because it's not just in countries like ours where politicians are becoming more interested and wanting to work with people like you in order to get this right for our own country. But internationally, I know there's lots of interest as well. So that's one thing that gives me a bit of hope.
Oh, brilliant, you guys. Thank you so much for all your input. I've just had a look at the question box, and we've got some really excellent questions, so I'm excited to get through them, and I will start with the first one. So this one I think might work best for you, Darren. Does the UK government have a clear digital strategy for post-transition, and will Dominic Cummings' recent departure change the government's position at all, specifically on online harms?
Good question. So the first question, the answer is no, and the second question is I don't know, but we'll find out. To be fair to the government, they are doing a number of things. Obviously, they've got the online harm stuff we've been talking about today. They are doing a national data strategy review, and I've got a meeting actually with John Whittingdale, who's the minister for this, next week to get an update on that. And you started to see how they brought forward this idea of kind of the positive benefits of digitization in other areas of policy. But is there a coherent digital policy? No, not really. And is there sufficient strength in that policy across departments that means that we continue to do this work irrespective of ministerial change? No. So there's still more work to be done on that.
Thank you, Simon, so much for that question. I hope that answered that. Another question from Charlie to all of the panelists. What tools and procedures could be provided to citizens to better equip them to tackle online harms themselves?
We're working, as I said before, I'm working on 2 projects. One of them is Mean by Big Data, understand citizens' data literacies. The other one is developing fake news immunity, where we are building a chatbot to help people understand fake news better. For me, the way to move forward is really to equip people with proper understanding, because these kind of online manipulations are going to keep on changing. We're going to have like disinformation, misinformation, conspiracy theories, and these are going to change as we go along. But if you provide with people with the proper tools, critical tools to engage online, I think that is a first step. At the moment, we have a huge divide from what we saw in our report between people who, who have less, a lower socioeconomic status and lower education attainment. So we're seeing, when we're talking about harms and, what kind of things people understand, what they can do with their data, if they understand online privacy, if they understand how to change their online privacy, it really much relates to the, existing inequalities. So I think that it's, technology is only exacerbating what is already problematic in our societies. And we need, I think the way to move forward is to provide people with tools. I think for adults, it's quite difficult because, with kids, they have institutions where they can learn about these things, and even in university, but adults don't really have public spaces where they can come. And unfortunately, this government in the past decade has closed hundreds of libraries, which are, one of the last places where people can go to, like, free public spaces to talk with other people and to acquire these kind of things. So for me, it's about data literacies and providing free and public spaces for people to actually acquire these skills. And these are mostly libraries. So these are my two sort of go-to places.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Eleanor, just in terms of like the breakdown of different demographics and I guess different geographies. Another way of looking at it is on a very particular case study. In May earlier this year, there was a 300% increase in hate crimes towards people of East and Southeast Asian heritage. So people who look like me, or people with heritage from China, Japan, Philippines, Korea, and so forth. Unfortunately, it happened due to the well, there was a lot around geopolitics and what the US president was saying, but also the origins of the coronavirus in terms of where it started in China. That was both online and offline. And what was really interesting is to see folk come together to try and respond to this. And so I think actually one of the simplest tools is using our social media channels to find other people who are also facing those harms. And I think organizations like Chain, who look at abuse against women, violence against women, that's another example. So each and every group who's impacted, there's something there about that peer-to-peer support. And also opening up channels which are trusted and independent for people to actually share their experiences of what harm they faced, whether it be around racism, whether it be around domestic violence, whether it be around something else where somebody has been impacted. So I think there's a bit there about the types of harms people are receiving, but also kind of creating spaces where people feel safe. And so it's not necessarily, you don't need to come up with a really complex and complicated tool. Sometimes it's about finding other people who have gone through the same thing and then connecting with those with the power to actually make a difference on those issues.
The only thing I would add to this question on consumer tools and consumer skills is that they're important, but they shouldn't be a distraction from ensuring proper responsibility on companies and providing regulatory frameworks. And the reason I say that is because if you look at, for example, consumer rights for goods and services more generally, consumers have got pretty good rights on those issues. Do many of them know what their rights are? No. Do people read terms and conditions? No. Do they know where to go if they need help? Broadly not. And that's on kind of rules that have been around for a very long time. So the idea that the kind of primary responsibility ought to be training everybody to know their digital rights and how to enforce them, I just don't think is number one on the list. I think it's important, but it shouldn't distract from these kind of broader principles around proper regulations and proper responsibilities at companies.
Yeah, thank you all. Actually, we've got a few questions exactly on that, Darren, so good segue. So we've got one question here, kind of two on tax and fine, and kind of the point of that. So given the inherent challenge with the internet being that anyone can post anything anytime, should we, or governments rather, challenge more effort instead into effective taxation, which can fund preventative measures rather than regulation, which will likely only take effect after the harms have been committed?
I think there's probably 2 points there. You can have regulation that provides an obligation on companies before harms are committed, because then if they commit the harms, you then enforce the rules. So it's not a kind of post hoc kind of competition policy framework where people can do what they like until a harm is identified. You can structure it the other way around. The issue on digital tax, I mean, I won't repeat what I've said earlier, but we've really got to kind of figure this out. But it is something we've ideally got to do on a multilateral basis. And to be fair to the government and our counterparts in France, France and the UK have been two countries that have said, okay, we're committed to multilateral conversations on this, but we're not going to hang around forever. And so they are starting to innovate with tax policy to try to push the dial a bit. I think we just need to continue to do that.
Yeah, great, actually. And then that leads on to the next question. A lot on Parliament and what the government's doing, Darren. Sorry, lots of questions for you. Maeve has asked, she says she agrees with the level of interest in Parliament and agrees that the interest that Parliament has in this area is growing, and she thinks this is great. MPs are more and more exposed to the impact of harms experienced by their constituents, but there's very much still a focus on this being an issue of content, taking down bad stuff, rather than business models and systems, which I fear is playing into the government's resistance to address legal but harmful activity through regulation. What more can be done to improve MPs' understanding of the systemic and design issues ahead of the introduction of the Online Harms Bill?
So the first thing I'd say, to be nice to my colleagues, is when you become an MP, it's a little bit like being a GP, right? You've kind of got to know a bit about everything. So, or generally you do, because your constituents ask you about everything. So you're not going to get a full house of people who are expert in kind of, you know, the digital market, for example. There will always be people who have a particular interest or specialism, as I do, in this issue that kind of lead the debate. What you do need to do, though, is try to get the kind of basic level of understanding and interest from colleagues, because ultimately you only get action if there's kind of a collective push to do that. And that's just about continuing to engage with your own MP, continuing to engage in this debate, working with organizations to try to raise these issues with politicians, and continuing to make sure that that kind of volume is being amplified, so that MPs who ultimately have to respond and represent their own constituents feel and understand the kind of demand from the public to deal with it. Some lessons around that, for example, in the climate change debate in recent years. So I would just say keep doing what I know many of you are already doing, and don't forget to talk to your own MP and get friends, relatives, contacts to talk to other MPs, because some constituencies will have less kind of engagement on these issues than others.
If I can just comment on this, I think, you know, academics have been talking about these things for more than a decade. I think there should be more collaboration between the government and academics, because we have been, you know, doing research on this. You know, my book is basically on this. A lot of other people's books and, you know, projects for even more than a decade. And I think that if we start more productive dialogue, because I do realize that, you know, not all MPs can actually understand what's happening with platforms, and it's hard for them to, you know, to grasp that, and because they're doing a lot of other things. If you actually ask specialists who are doing these kind of things every day, I think that we have a real chance here to move forward. And of course, organizations like WebRoots and, you know, people who are, you know, activists who have been doing this. So I think a bit more collaboration between the government and academics and, you know, digital rights activists would be a really great way to move forward.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, no, like on that note of just collaboration and dialogue, it's such a good point, and it's such a good jumping point for us to move forward after this conversation, which has been amazing, by the way. We've covered such topical and increasingly important issues today on online harms and regulating social media. And so I just want to extend a huge thanks to all of the panelists today for all of your amazing insights. Been truly valuable, and I think I can speak for the whole of the audience today when I say that this has been incredibly interesting and inspiring. And obviously it's given us all a few ideas of what we need to do next and where we need to go from here. So I can't wait to follow all the important work that you guys continue to do. Thank you so much to the audience for joining us today, and thank you for your wonderful questions.